If you have made somebody else host, that host will have to give you permission to screen share. You may have relinquished your power to screen share. That's done? Okay, we're ready. Okay, so we're all ready to start. Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this online event in which we'll look at some of Cavafy's poetry and two of his literary descendants in modern Greek poetry. We'll read poems by C.P. Cavafy, Manolis Anagnostakis, and Dinos Christianopoulos. Anagnostakis and Christianopoulos both lived and wrote poetry in Thessalonica, the second largest city of modern Greece, and they represent two different lines of Cavafy reception. Some of their poems are influenced by the Alexandrian poet. However, they succeed in forging a uniquely creative interaction with the original Cavafy text. In our meeting, we'll examine how these different poetic compositions inscribe and recompose the Cavafy original. I'd like to introduce Dr. Maria G. Xantu, who will introduce these poets and guide us through the selected poems. Maria, thank you. Cavafy is a familiar name, but these other poets are less well known. So we look forward to hearing more about them and to reading examples of their poetry. So over to you.
Thank you very much, dear Sarah. I would like to thank everyone for accepting my invitation and for participating to this online webinar. I would also like to thank Sarah Scott, Janet Oscholak, and Professor Armand Angour, who also will be contributing to Cavafy's reading. So the idea of this webinar came when I realized that Cavafy's Greek literary descendants remain unsung or unknown in the wider public, in stark contrast to their literary progenitor. Who are these people who followed Cavafy's cue in composing poetry, and where did they live? With Cavafy, the saying, all roads lead to Rome, and especially to New Rome, alias known as Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, acquires a new meaning. With his Greek descendants, these roads that lead to Rome pass through another city near and dear to me, a city which always stands right beside Istanbul, and this is my hometown, Thessalonica, known as Selanik in Turkish, Saloniko in Ladino, Solun in Slavic. These descendants lived and wrote in Thessalonica, and they represent two different lines of Cavafyesque reception, as Sarah Scott mentioned. The one, and you will allow me now to screen share. Now, the one is Manolis Anagnostakis, is on your left down side of the slide, and Dinos Christianopoulos on the upper side, on the right upper side of the slide. As I mentioned earlier, these two poets represent two different voices that animate a Cavafyesque persona in a different context. Manolis Anagnostakis unfolds the political perspective, and Dinos Christianopoulos, the voice of homoeroticism, political historicity, and self-reflection. I will just stop sharing in case someone else enters in order to admit anyone. I would refrain from calling Christianopoulos a queer poet, as in a recent interview before his death, Christianopoulos rejected the prevalence of this kind of categorization for his poetry. As John Taylor notes, and I quote, "It would be an error to restrict Dinos Christianopoulos, born in 1931, to the ranks of Greek homosexual poets. He is a major contemporary poet tout court. Although selection of sensitive and transparent poems have appeared in several European languages. Strangely enough, I have found relatively few traces of his prose and poetry in English, and none whatsoever in readily accessible editions abroad. But first things first, I chose 6 different poems, 3 by Cavafy, 2 which act as the original or the point of reference, 1 by Anagnostakis and 2 by Christianopoulos, so that we may get an idea what Anagnostakis and Christianopoulos try to do and how they interact with their original. Before I move on to some sort of close reading, I would like to offer you some insight about the 3 poets so we have a better understanding of their literary pedigree and output. Most importantly, I would like to offer you an account of my chosen title from Istanbul to Thessalonica. Cavafy was self-defined as an Istanbulite, a Constantinopolitis. In a short autobiographical notice, he states, and I quote, "I am an Istanbulite, Constantinopolitis regarding my origin, but I was born in Alexandria, in a house of Sheriff Street. I left when I was young and spent most of my childhood in England. Later, I visited this country when I was old enough, but for a short period of time, I spent time in France as well. During my teens, I lived for 2 years in Istanbul. Actually, it was more than 2. I haven't visited Greece for quite a long time. We have learned to connect Cavafy with Alexandria, but we focus very little on the impact Istanbul as a city of his origin exerted on him. Both his parents, Petros and Chariklia Cavafy, were from Istanbul and of Phanariot origin. Cavafy prided himself of his Phanariot roots and ancestors. He spent 3 years in the city from 1882 until 1885, when his family moved to Istanbul from Egypt after the outbreak of the 1882 Anglo-Egyptian War. The 3 years Cavafy spent in Istanbul until his family's return to Alexandria in 1885 acted as a formative period for the young in the making poet. And you will see, can you see my screen?
Not yet. You should
Not
see.
yet, Maria.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I will share my screen now. So, GP Savidis, I don't want to see this, edition of the so-called hidden poets, where you can see on the right side of the slide, the poems that are not included in the 154 poems of the Cavafy canon or critical edition, also prepared by Savidis, bears witness to the young poet's attempt to compose poetry and to develop his literary style, which looks quite diverse. These hidden poems deal with different themes and motives. For example, homoerotics, love poems, historical poems, poems based on coins, and some of them offer glimpses or snapshots of scenes in Istanbul's everyday life. The titles of the latter poems are eloquent. And again, I quote the titles. The Beyzadeh, or To His Lady Love, written in 1884. Dünya Güzeli, I hope my Turkish pronunciation is accepted, written in 1884. Yeniköy in 1885. And also Living Therapia in 1882. Especially this poem is directly composed in English, where he that's why we're going to read it. In all poems, we detect the young poet's tendency to experiment with the style, the motifs, the themes, the language, ranging from katharevousa, to demotic mixed with archaic Greek elements, Turkish loanwords, and dashes or features of the Greek Istanbuliot dialect with the use of accusative singular me or se. His view of life in Istanbul is depicted in his English poem, Therapia, and I would like to kindly ask to Professor Armand Agur to read it for us, if he's kind enough.
Hello, hi Maria, thank you. Yes, I'd be delighted to do that. I shall read it in the words that Cavafy himself wrote in English. Goodbye to Therapia and joys of the hotel, good dinners that make you exultingly swell, good beds that refresh you from the toil of the day, fine sights near which you'd wish ever to stay. To all these good things, the time is well nigh, I must bid a goodbye. However, Kadikio's opposite shore I must hail, though by far more simple and poor. But they say what is simple is good at the heart, and where goodness is, we may well spare art. So at humble Kadikioe, let us not rail, but bid it all hail.
Thank you very much. I hope Arman and all native speakers of English find Cavafy's English language agreeable. So another poem that also provides us a glimpse into the life of Istanbul is the poem called Yenikioi or Nihori, which Janet Ozcolak has translated it for us in Turkish, and I would like to kindly ask her to read it for us, and then we will have the English translation by Sarah Scott. So, Janet.
Thank you, Maria. Okay. Yeniköy. Yabancı, ne zaman ki bir köy görürsün, doğa gülümser sana. Her çınar ağacının yakınına gül kadar güzel bir kız saklanır. Orada durmalısın. Yabancı, Yeniköy'e varmışsındır. Ne zaman ki akşam olur ve eğer çıkarsan dışarıya dolaşmaya ve çam ağaçları çıkar önüne, daha fazla gitme artık. Nerede bulabilirsin Yeniköy'den daha güzel bir yer? Dünyanın hiçbir yerinde bahar bu kadar canlı değil. Başka diyarlardaki dağlar bizim tepelerin asaletinden mahzun. Eğer Yeniköy'de bir süre kalırsan sadece doğanın parfümüyle sarhoş olursun. Umma ki başka yerlerde buradaki yeşili bulacaksın. Tepelerden bak ve gör aşağıdaki düzlüğü ve söyle ki sevemezsin küçük Yeniköy'ümüzü. Yabancı, zannetme ki abartıyı severim. Toprağı zengin, bereketli nice yerler var. Ama tabii ki sen de hemfikir olacaksın. Özel bir şey var Yeniköy'ün meyve ve çiçeklerinde. Eğer benimle Kumaryotsa Meryem Ana Kilisesi'ne gitmek istersen, aşırı dindarlığımı affet orada. İddia ediyorum Allah duaları dindar Yeniköy'den başka türlü dinliyor. Eğer kalamayacaksan ey yabancı, ayrılmadan bir pazar günü mutlaka Gregoris Kilesi'ne gitmelisin. Gençliği, huzuru, coşkuyu orada göreceksin ve anlayacaksın Yeniköy'ümüzü. I translated from English and it was a very quick and rough translation, so I apologize. I will work on it more. It was a very quick and rough.
I think that you responded to the challenge very well and in a very short time, I can assure you. I hope the native speakers of Turkish also agree, okay? So I would
musical, it's beautiful. It is.
Thank you, Sofia. So, Sarah, could you now offer us the English translation of Nikioi or Nihori?
Yes, this is the translation by D. Mendelssohn. Stranger, when you see a town where nature smiles and where a girl as lovely as a rose is hidden near every plane tree, you must stop there. Stranger, you have reached Nihori. And if, when evening comes, you go outside to stroll and find before you walnut trees, do not proceed any further on your way. Where else could you seek a place more lovely than Nihuri? Nowhere else on earth are springs as fresh as these. Mountains elsewhere do not have our hills' nobility, and you will be inebriated by earth's perfume alone if you stay a while in Nihuri. Do not hope to find elsewhere the greenery that you will see there. From the hilltop, look and see the plains below, and say you could not love this, our little Nihuri. Do not think, O stranger, that I love hyperbole. There are many places that have rich and fruitful fields, but there is something special, as you'll certainly agree, about the fruit and flowers of Nihuri. If you should wish to go with me inside the church of the Virgin of Kumaris, forgive my zealotry when I am there. Prayers, I dare say, win a different grace in pious Nihuri. If you cannot stay, O stranger, then before you leave, you must go one Sunday to the quay of Gregory. Peace and youth and joy you'll see, and you will know what it is, our Nihuri.
Thank you very much, Sarah. This particular poem and also the commemoration of the birth of Cavafy gave the inspiration for a small celebration. On 13th April 2013, Cavafy's bust, marking the 150th anniversary of his birth, designed by the Greek artist Aspasia Papadoperaki, was erected in Genikioi, Panagia Roum Kilise, by the mayor of Sarıyer, that you see now speaking at the podium on the slide, Şükrü Genç, in the framework of a conference organized by the famous Zografion School of Istanbul, Mandoulides Private School in Thessalonica, and Averov School of Alexandria, Egypt, under the auspices of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Istanbul. As I mentioned earlier, the range of themes in Cavafy's early poems is wide. However, they foreshadow those which are later further developed into his most successful and popular poems. In his case, the axiom, big things have small beginnings, is true and applies fully. One example is the poem called Second Odyssey, written in 1894. And I would like Sarah to read it for us in the English translation by Daniel Mendelssohn.
A second Odyssey, and a great one too, greater than the first perhaps. But alas, without a Homer, without hexameters. Small was his ancestral house, small was his ancestral town, and all his Ithaca was small. Telemachus's affection, the faithfulness of Penelope, the years of his father's old age, his old companions, the people's unswerving love, the blessed repose of the house, entered like rays of joy into the heart of the seafarer, and, like rays, they sank. Inside of him there awakened the thirst for the sea. He hated the air of dry land. Phantasms of the West disturbed his sleep at night. Nostalgia took hold of him for voyages and early morning arrivals in harbours, which, with what joy you enter for the first time. Telemachus's affection, the faithfulness of Penelope, the years of his father's old age, his old companions. The people's unswerving love and the peace and repose of the house, they all bored him, and he left. When Ithaca's headlands slipped away bit by bit before him, and he voyaged westward at full sail towards Iberia, towards the Heraclean pillars, far from every Achaean sea, he felt that he lived once again, that he'd slipped the burdensome bonds of things that were known and familiar. And his heart, adventurous, exalted, coldly, empty of love.
Thank you very much, Sarah. In the second Odyssey, some of the motifs found in the famous Ithaca, which was composed in 1911, are already present. And may I remind you that the second Odyssey is composed in 1894. However, the tone is different, as you realized. Second Odyssey acts as the foil of Ithaca, or its reversed image. This, of course, applies to Cavafy's other poems, which seem to form a couple of one positive and one negative example. But I have deliberately picked Second Odyssey and Ithaca because of Ithaca's popularity among Cavafy's readers other than Greek native speakers. We realize it if we read Ithaca, the famous Ithaca, which was composed in 1911, and I would like now to ask Janet to read it for us in Turkish.
İthaka. İthaka'ya doğru yola çıktığın zaman dile ki uzun sürsün yolculuğun. Serüven dolu, bilgi dolu olsun. Ne Restrigonlardan kork, ne Kikloplardan, ne de öfkeli Poseidon'dan. Bunlardan hiçbiri çıkmaz karşına. Düşlerin yüceyse, gövdeni ve ruhunu ince bir heyecan sarmışsa eğer, ne Restrigonlarla rastlarsın, ne Kikloplara, ne azgın Poseidon'a. Onları sen kendi ruhunda taşımadıkça, kendi ruhun onları dikmedikçe karşına. Dile ki uzun sürsün yolun, nice yaz sabahları olsun. Eşsiz bir sevinç ve mutluluk içinde önceden hiç görmediğin limanlara girdin. Durup Fenike'nin çarşılarında eşi benzeri olmayan mallar al. Sedefle mercan, abanozla kehribar ve her türlü baş döndürücü kokular. Bu baş döndürücü kokulardan alabildiğin kadar. Nice Mısır şehirlerine uğra. Ne öğrenebilirsen öğrenmeye bak bilgelerinden. Hiç aklından çıkarma İthaka'yı. Oraya varmak senin başlıca yazgın. Ama yolculuğu tez bitirmeye de kalkma sakın. Varsın yıllarca sürsün. Daha iyi. Sonunda kocamış biri olarak demir at adana. Yol boyunca kazandığın bunca şeylere zengin İthaka'nın sana zenginlik vermesini ummadan. Sana bu güzel yolculuğu verdi İthaka. O olmasa yola hiç çıkmayacaktın. Ama sana verecek bir şeyi yok bundan başka. Onu yoksul buluyorsan aldanmış sanma kendini. Geçtiğin bunca deneyden sonra öyle bilgeleştin ki artık elbet biliyorsundur ne anlama geldiğini İthakaların.
Thank you very much, Janet. And Sarah, could you offer us now the English translation?
As you set out for Ithaca, hope the journey is a long one, full of adventure, full of discovery. Laestrygonians and Cyclops, angry Poseidon, don't be afraid of them. You'll never find things like that on your way, as long as you keep your thoughts raised high, as long as a rare excitement stirs your spirit and your body. Laestrygonians and Cyclops, wild Poseidon, you won't encounter them unless you bring them along inside your soul, unless your soul sets them up in front of you. hope the journey is a long one. May there be many a summer morning when, with what pleasure, what joy, you come into harbours seen for the first time. May you stop at a Phoenician trading stations to buy fine things, mother of pearl and coral, amber and ebony, sensual perfume of every kind. As many sensual perfumes as you can. And may you visit many Egyptian cities to gather stores of knowledge from their scholars. Keep Ithaca always in your mind. Arriving there is what you are destined for, but do not hurry the journey at all. Better if it lasts for years, so you are old by the time you reach the island, wealthy with all you have gained on the way, not expecting Ithaca to make you rich. Ithaca gave you the marvelous journey. Without her, you would not have set out. She has nothing left to give you now. And if you find her poor, Ithaca won't have fooled you. Wise as you will have become, so full of experience, you will have understood by then what these Ithacas mean.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Ithaca and Second Odyssey set the standard, as I already mentioned, for other poems to imitate their contemplative, self-reflective tone, and one of modern Greek poets who have followed suit is Dinos Christianopoulos, a poet, literary person, an art critic, and philologist who lived but never traveled away from, yes, this is true, died in Thessalonica on the 11th of August 2020. Christianopoulos was born to Yannis and Persephone Dimitriou in 1931, and 2 months after his birth, he was baptized Konstantinos. When he was 1.5 years old, he was adopted by Anastasios and Fani Dimitriadis, who allegedly chose him because of the similarity of surnames. And I mention this because it plays a very special part, this motif plays a special part in his poetry, but I'm not going to examine this perspective of Christianopoulos' poetry. In 1945, young Konstantinos began using the pseudonym Christianopoulos, child or son of Christ, a choice reflecting the Christian themes that would soon appear in his oeuvre, but also, according to his testimony, due to the Orthodox Church, which contributed in offering food during the German occupation of Thessalonica, during the hardship and starvation the city has been through. After earning a degree in classical philology at the University of Thessalonica, now known as Aristotle University, in 1954, he founded the most important literary periodical called the Diagonal or Diagonios in 1958. Later, he began publishing books under the logo Diagonal Publications, Ekdosis Diagonios, as Diagonios is the name of the one of the most important intersection of Thessalonica Main Street, Ioannou Tsimiski and Pavlou Mela streets, according to the Ernest Hebrar's Modern City Center Plan, approved by Eleftherios Venizelos after the Great Fire of 1970, which wiped out almost the half of the city center. Nearly all his own books have been self-published at his own press in exquisite and impeccably perfect editions. Intimately associated with his hometown, Christianopoulos has spent his entire life in Thessalonica, hardly visiting places in mainland Greece or the islands, making only the most essential trips to Athens, primarily to offer readings of his poetry. Early on, Christianopoulos' poetry took off from that of Cavafy, And in Christianopoulos' poetry, Cavafy's delicate touch of irony and implicit eroticism is immediately traceable. However, he is no mere epigone or descendant of Cavafy. As himself puts it, he is the poet of the remorse, the guilt conscience of a poet who discovers that because of his pursuit of pleasure, he has been indifferent to the suffering of his fellow men. The most explicit expression of this motive occurs in the poem The Splinter. We are not going to read it, but I'm referring it for the sake of my presentation, which evokes the assassination of Grigoris Lambrakis in Thessalonica, a leftist political leader and member of the Greek parliament. On the night of 22nd May 1963, Lambrakis, while leaving a political rally in Thessalonica, was run over by a small three-wheeled delivery truck and clubbed to death by hired henchmen. The event became known abroad through Vasilis Vasilikosis' novel Z or Zita in 1966 and through Costa Gavras' film Z, starring Jean-Louis Trintignant, Yves Montand, and Irene Papas, with the iconic music of Mikis Theodorakis. Christianopoulos' own memory of the event involves an imperceptible splinter that continues to torment him. Many of Christianopoulos' poems are intimately attached to Thessalonica. Place names often crop up, such as when in his poem Western Quarters, he begins naming specific suburban districts. Christianopoulos does not refrain from using the Turkish names of Thessalonica's urban districts. The self-reflective sentiment of melancholy is evident in his version of Ithaca, which Sarah Scott will read it for us in the English translation.
I do not know if I left as a result or from a need to escape from myself, from the narrow and small Ithaca with her Christian associations and her choking ethic. Anyway, it was no solution, just a half measure. And after that, I rolled down road after road, acquiring wounds and experiences. The friends I fell in love with lost the most, and I was left alone, trembling, that anyone saw me, that once I spoke of as ideal. Now, I come back with a suspicious effort to seem irreproachable, upright. I come back, and I am, my God, like the prodigal who abandons the vagrancy, embittered, and turns to the good-hearted father to live in his bosom, though a debauched person. I bring Poseidon inside me, who always keeps me far away. Even so, I may still reach out, as if Ithaca will find me the solution.
Thank you very much, Sarah. However, this is one side of Christianopoulos' poetry. The other side is the one that challenges Cavafy and dares to invert his model, as is the case in his poem Thermopyle, a direct reference to Cavafy's original, which we will listen right away by Sarah Scott.
Honor to all of those who in their lives have settled on and guard a Thermopylae, never stirring from their obligations, just and equitable in all of their affairs, but full of pity nonetheless, and of compassion, generous whenever they're rich, and again, when they're poor, generous in small things, and helping out again as much as they are able, always speaking nothing but the truth, yet without any hatred for those who lie. And more honor still is due to them when they foresee, and many do foresee, that Ephialtes will make his appearance in the end, and that the Medes will eventually break through.
Now, Christianopoulos wrote a poet also under the same title, Thermopylae, where he criticizes the heroic image of the few Lacedaemonians fighting against the Persian Empire that Cavafy conveys in the poem that Sarah Scott just read for us. So I'm going to ask her to read now Christianopoulos' version of Ithaca.
Looking at Paul's Haran massacre, Cadmus, showing all the horrors of Lynch's law, my mind went to the similar crypteia of the ancient Lacedaemonians, who before going to the army, they should have tyrannized in secret the poor helots. And I thought that this can be ruled out. Leonidas's 300, shortly before the battle, had trained themselves, and they also lynched some miserable helots, obedient to their laws. So for whom did they fight? For the freedom of Greeks? Or maybe for the sake of their bosses, so that they can be left undisturbed while slaughtering their slaves.
Thank you very much, Sarah. As Christianopoulos professes in one of his interviews, the inspiration for this poem came to him after the critical reading of Xenophon's Constitution of the Spartans and the Old Oligarch. He decided to subvert Cavafy's representation of the fight of Thermopylae as a patriotic war turned into a social fight. Christianopoulos criticizes and questions the Spartans' motives for standing against the Persians. Having studied classical philology, Christianopoulos read ancient Greek and Latin texts and was able to read the sources and form his poets accordingly so that they may express his criticism, ideas, and emotions. Now I'm going to turn to the second poet of today's webinar, which is Manolis Anagnostakis. Anagnostakis, who lived between 1925 and 2005, was poet, public figure, and influential commentator of the cultural, social, and political history of Greece post-World War II. I quote Kalotichos, Anagnostakis is the poet of the Greek post-war who examined the discrepancy surfacing in the Greek society between the consolidation of democracy after the authoritarian decades of the 50s, the 60s, and the Greek dictatorship, and the re-establishment of the principles of freedom of speech and the former leftist comrades' capitalization on their real or alleged contribution to the struggles and sacrifices of previous darker decades to derive just reward by vying for political or administrative office in ever-corrupt governments. Anagnostakis probed the dimensions of the social phenomenon with a firm pragmatism. He did so with an unflinching dedication to thinking through the relation of poetry and politics. He weighed the efficacy of the word in action with a lasting concern for the form such enunciation need take to be relevant, committed, and true in times of doubt. Anagnostakis' favorite literary strategy in terms of Cavafy reception was the stylistic allusion to Cavafy's poem titles, which Anagnostakis himself appropriated in many of his poems. For example, Thessaloniki, Days of 1969. Another Cavafyesque literary strategy was Anagnostakis' follow suit is speaking out in carefully structured rhetorical contexts that undermine the self-importance of the poetic characters and render suspect the authority of their pronouncements. Anagnostakis, like Christianopoulos, did not hesitate to question Cavafy's literary achievement. He was especially suspicious of whether any poetic effect by Cavafy, as distinct from his themes, came across in translation. However, one cannot fail to discern substantial affinities between the two poets, including a prosaically grounded lyricism, an erotic vibrancy molded through either politics or history, and a distaste for rhetoric. The poem I chose to present you with Youth of Sidon, 1970, along with another one, Thessaloniki Days of 1961, which we are not going to read, are explicitly styled in direct reference to Cavafy. And by questioning Cavafy, it appears that Anagnostakis broadly questioned Greek poetry and poetry in general. Of course, there are important differences between the two poets. Cavafy's work was not consistently recognized while alive, except some extent outside Greece, flourished as a latecomer to poetry, and circulated most of his work semi-privately. By contrast, Anagnostakis demonstrated versatility in traditional versification early on. He published his first book as a 20-year-old, while Greece was on the verge of civil war, had his second volume printed while he was imprisoned at the age of 23, wrote poetry after a military dictatorship took power in 1967, and then stopped writing poems around 1971 when he no longer felt the need to do so. So after giving you some historical background, I would like to ask Sarah to read for us the translation of Cavafy's Young Men of Sidon, 400 AD.
The actor, whom they had brought to entertain them, recited, among other things, a few well-chosen epigrams. The room opened onto the garden and was pervaded with a faint scent of flowers, which mingled with the perfumes of the 5 scented Sidonian young men. He read verses of Meleager and Crinagoras and Rhiannos. But when he recited the lines, "This monument covers Aeschylus, son of Euphorion the Athenian," emphasizing, perhaps a little too much, stalwart valor and Marathonian grove, an eager young man who was a passionate lover of letters sprang up and exclaimed, "Oh, I do not care for these verses. Such expressions savor somewhat of faint-heartedness. Let the great poet give, I say, to this art all his strength, all his care. And again, remember his art in his adversity, or when his life is ebbing. This I expect of him and demand. And that he estrange not from his mind the fine sense of tragedy, Agamemnon, admirable Prometheus, the figures of Orestes and Cassandra, the 7 against Thebes. And for the sake of his memory, he mentioned only that in the soldiers' ranks, he also fought against Datis and Artaphernes.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So, as you see here, Cavafy creates a very unique, special literary environment with young men of Sidon reading epigrams and living the real intellectual life. Now, we are going to read Manolis Anagnostakis' Young Men of Sidon, 1970, which is, in a way, a response to Cavafy's poem.
Actually, we shouldn't complain. Your company's good and congenial, full of youth, fresh young girls, stout-bodied lads, all passion and love for life and action. And your songs too, good, with meaning and substance, so very human, so moving, about infants that die in other continents, about heroes killed in former times, about revolutionaries, black, green, and yellow ones, about man's grief in his overall suffering. It's especially to your credit that you involve yourselves in the issues and struggles of our age. You directly and actively make your presence felt, in view of which I think you more than deserve in twos, in threes, to play, to fall in love, and unwind for sure, pal, after such exertion. They've aged us prematurely, yours. Do you realize?
Thank you very much, Sarah. With this last reading, and before we conclude, I would like to ask you to see this very subtle irony that Anagnostakis invests in his poetry. His political meaning is there, but he tries to convey it in an ironic way, and in order to convey this message, he uses the political background and also the situation of the age that he wrote this poem, especially in 1970. The historical background of this reading is, of course, the young people in May in Paris, and as you are able to realize, the poetic effect he uses in a way Cavafy as a pivot in order to convey his own message and his criticism to the young people. We should not forget that Manolis Anagnostakis was an acting leftist. He was imprisoned for his ideas, and he was suppressed during the junta in 1967 and 1974. So in a way, he criticizes the young men who he perceives that they say that they fight, but this fight is not like the one that he fought or his contemporaries fought. Now we would like to conclude all this reading, and I would like to have your ideas, your questions, and your discussion in the remaining 12 minutes. So Sarah is on you as you're our hostess for tonight.
Right, so yes, thank you very much, Maria. Really interesting presentation. So if anybody would like to comment or have questions, anyone raise your hand and unmute. Okay.
It was wonderful. I enjoyed every minute of it, and the reading of the poems, it was revealing to me how the poetry of all three poems can sound in other languages. I am not, my Turkish is very, very little. I'm studying Turkish, but I have to read again and again to know, which I will do. But my English is good, and it was really a revelation how wonderful. I heard Cavafy's before, but not Christianopoulos and Anagnostakis. And I think you did a lot of justice to all three of them, actually. And Maria, it was great. I learned so many things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia. I think I would like to thank my colleagues, Sarah Scott and Janet Oscholak. Sarah prepared the readings in literally zero time because I gave her a very short notice, and Janet translated one whole poem of Cavafy in Turkish, also in a very short notice. But we decided to read Cavafy in two languages, like English and Turkish, because of course he came from Istanbul, so his family definitely spoke Turkish. So this is like a tribute to his mother city. Of course, he wrote in Greek, and he is a Greek poet, but also he, as Professor Armanda Grosso read a poet in English, he composed poetry directly in English. So his English was also very, very good.
It was.
I think Mert wants to.
Go ahead, please.
Dear Maria, and dear Janet and Sarah and Mr. Dango, thank you very much for first, Maria. It's very enlightening webinar, and Janet, Sarah, and Mr. Dango, thank you for all readings, and I thank you again for this English-Turkish reading. I think, as Sophia said, it was very much justice for Cavafy and his legacy. I want to ask a comment-like question to Maria.
Mm-hmm.
I observed both in readings and your thorough explanation about Christianopoulos.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I never read and met this dear poet, and I saw a kind of similarity to Seferis in poetic approach, and as a poetic persona, I felt an adversary to Cavafy's and almost antagonistic approach to Cavafy's poetry and poetic thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree or disagree? What is your thought about this particular poet? Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Mert. This is a wonderful question, and I think your instinct hit a spot, because you are right. There is an emulatio. This is a Latin literary term that we all know, all philologists know. Yes, there is an antagonism. There is an antagonism. Christianopoulos is definitely antagonistic to Cavafy's. Of course, Cavafy's is his set standard. He's setting a standard for Christianopoulos poetry. But of course, as you realized, the influence, Seferis' influence is there. But let us also not forget that Seferis himself read Cavafy's, although we have to keep in mind that, and by the way, that's why I chose the title for my presentation, From Istanbul to Thessalonica. Cavafy's was not accepted from the Greek establishment, the Hellenic establishment, the establishment of the Greek state right away as a poet. People in Athens didn't accept him as a quality poet. So it was first the people like Forster or other English people who read his poetry, who accepted him, and this acceptance from abroad led him gradually to the acceptance of his fellow countrymen, which of course is a pity, but coming from Greece and Turkey, we know how this works. Okay. Anyway, yes, Christianopoulos is antagonistic to Cavafy's, but again, if you read some other poets, you will realize that his antagonism also moves on to Seferis. Some might call it influence or impact, but it is definitely, if Cointilian with his Instituti Oratoria was here, he would call it an emulatio.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Matt.
It gave me very insight to how to put this new poet, just given the justice of the poet. It was much helpful. Thank you.
And I'm happy to provide, if you contact me, with additional bibliographical notes and references. So, you know, English. I mean, in English books. So, and English translations, and of course, I know that you can read Greek. If you would like to read both poets.
I will definitely do it.
Thank you.
I will definitely write you up after the very instant of this conference. Thank you. Thank you again.
Any other questions, comments? Please jump in.
I wanted to say thank you so much, Maria. I've been looking forward to this lecture ever since we've been doing the Greek literature hour. So, Efharistopoli, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bettina. I would like to thank Arman, especially because he attended. I know his program is quite stressed and heavy, and I would like to thank him for his presence here. It means it's very important for our community, for me, Sarah, and Janet. I gave him this poem. I asked him to read for us the Therapia poem because it's the only poem who is directly written by Cavafy in English. So since Arman is also involved in composing poetry, he will be able to appreciate it even more.
Thank you. I mean, just one thing. I mean, I noticed the accent that Cavafy put on it was therapia.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a particular reason for that?
It's therapia, ta therapia.
Yes, he's put an accent, hasn't he, in his writing on the A, the first A, for some reason.
I will look.
Have a look.
Yes, I will look at it. Yes. Katikoi. Okay.
So
yes, because
that's why I said it like that, because I read
yes,
it.
Yes.
Thank you, Maria. It was great.
Thank you, merci, Hélène.
Oui, bravo.
And also we have the mention of a French name like Ernest Hébrard, who was one famous French architect who redesigned the city plan of Thessalonica after the Great Fire in 1970. It's a very important historical event because it had destroyed much of the city, especially what has been called the Jewish quarter, and where the people, the Jewish community lived and worked. So Ernest Hébrard was invited by Eleftherios Venizelos to redesign the city center, and the plan exists now, and the city is growing according to Ernest Hébrard's plan. Of course, Thessalonica is not only, it has a very long past. We know that it's a Hellenistic, it's a Roman city, it's a Byzantine city, it is an Ottoman city. It is before that, before Hellenistic, it was a Macedonian city. It is a Greek city. It's the city of, yes, of Kemal Atatürk. So all people, and of course her trademark is the Beyaz Kule, which is an Ottoman monument. So I hope you will be able to visit and see how the city looks like now.
Thank you, Maria. You've given us a great context to understand all of these poems and all of these poets in a much wider context, and bringing together, as you say, with the translations and the perspectives that you've given us. It certainly inspired me to read more of all of these poets. And I would say that those who haven't actually spoken have been putting very positive comments in the chat. I wanted that to go on the recording, so for the record. Thank you so much, and thank you all.
And I would like just to add what Iulia said. Yes, it was also a Jewish city with a vibrant and thriving Jewish community. Thank you all. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care. İyi geceler.
İyi geceler. Take care.
İyi geceler.
Thank you very much, Arman.
It was wonderful, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you.
Can we stop the recording maybe at this point,
Yes.
since lots of people have gone?
That's what you